On Good Friday in 1788, a candle caught the lace curtains of a private chapel in New Orleans. Within minutes, the roof was burning. The city had one obvious way to warn everyone: ring the bells of St. Louis Church, but the bells remained silent. According to contemporary accounts, church authorities would not allow them to ring because Catholic tradition required silence on Good Friday. While families carried furniture into the streets and strong winds drove fire from roof to roof, one of the city's most powerful alarms was never used. 5 hours later, roughly 856 of New Orleans' 1,100 buildings had burned. The church, town hall, jail, armory, barracks, bakeries, stores, and hundreds of homes were gone. Then, just 6 years later, the city burned again. But these fires did more than destroy New Orleans. They replaced its wooden French town with brick walls, stucco facades, tiled roofs, courtyards, and iron balconies. The architecture tourists admire today began with the alarm that never sounded. To understand how one household fire consumed almost an entire city, walk backward into the New Orleans that existed before 1788. French engineers had arranged the town around the Place d'Armes, the open square now known as Jackson Square. Streets ran toward and along the Mississippi. A church, town hall, barracks, stores, and homes formed a compact colonial center. But the buildings look different from the French Quarter tourists know today. Most were low and light. Cypress was abundant and easier to obtain than brick. Houses used timber posts, wooden galleries, shingled roofs, and in some cases, brick packed between a wooden frame. Many sat within garden lots rather than forming today's continuous masonry street walls. This town was practical. It was also a connected field of fuel. Cooking depended on open hearths. Candles lit rooms and devotional altars. Wood shingles dried beneath the subtropical sun. Galleries, fences, sheds, kitchens, warehouses, hay, firewood, and roof structures offered flame a path from one property to the next. There was no pressurized water system, no modern fire department, and no reliable citywide alarm beyond voices, drums, and bells. The risk was woven into everyday life. A family could spend a day boiling food, heating water, mending clothes, tending children, receiving customers, and saying prayers without thinking of itself as living beside catastrophe. Fire was ordinary. The disaster came when ordinary flame met wind, density, and delay. A few buildings already hinted at a safer future. The Ursuline convent, completed in the French period with thick masonry walls and a tile roof, stood apart from much of the town. It would survive both great fires. But buildings like it were expensive exceptions. That difference matters. New Orleans did not lack knowledge of fire-resistant construction. It lacked the money, materials, regulation, and political will to make that construction normal. Then, early on the afternoon of March the 21st, 1788, flame appeared at the corner of Chartres and Toulouse streets. What failed next was not only a wooden roof, it was the city's entire system for recognizing danger. The fire began at the residence of Don Vicente José Núñez, a Spanish military paymaster or treasurer. The best-known accounts place its origin in the household chapel, where a candle ignited lace drapery before flame reached the roof. Later retellings decorate the scene with rows of unattended candles, but the precise number is uncertain. The essential fact is simpler: a private act of devotion became a public emergency. At approximately 1:30 in the afternoon, smoke rose above one house. Then the wind took control. A strong southeasterly wind pushed sparks and burning material across the tightly packed town. Fire climbed roofs, crossed yards, entered attics, and moved along wooden galleries. Residents formed bucket lines, dragged possessions outside, and tried to pull down structures before flame reached them. But every delay gave the wind another roof, and above the panic, the church bells remained quiet. The refusal has survived, because it compresses the tragedy into one unbearable image, a city burning on its most solemn Christian day, while an instrument capable of warning everyone was silenced by the meaning of that day. The bells may not have stopped the disaster. Wind, wood, and lack of water had already made New Orleans dangerously vulnerable, but alarms buy time, and time was exactly what residents did not have. Within about 5 hours, the fire swept across roughly 18 blocks. Most accounts place the destruction at approximately 856 buildings out of around 1,100, though period counts vary. St. Louis Church and its presbytery burned. The Cabildo and other civic buildings burned. The jail, barracks, armory, and commercial houses burned. Nearly every bakery in the city burned. That last detail turns a spectacular disaster into an intimate one. When the flames ended, thousands of people did not simply lack houses. They lacked the places that produced daily bread. Parish and municipal records disappeared with the church and town hall, opening holes in family histories that remain difficult to fill. Shops lost stock, craftspeople lost tools, enslaved people lost quarters and whatever possessions they had been able to keep. Residents who had escaped bodily harm stood in streets filled with furniture, livestock, smoke, ash, and people asking where they would sleep. Contemporary letters claimed remarkably few deaths, with one famous report insisting that not a single man perished. That may reflect genuine fortune. It may also reflect whose injuries and deaths officials counted. What is certain is that the main human cost was homelessness, hunger, lost livelihoods, and forced displacement on a scale the small city had never experienced. By nightfall, the French colonial town still existed on maps and in memory. On the ground, most of it was gone. The obvious question was how to rebuild. The more dangerous question was whether residents would rebuild the same city that had just burned. Disaster histories often jump from destruction to reconstruction as if a plan appeared the next morning. Families first had to find one another. Food had to be found after the bakeries were lost. Merchants searched ruins for coins, ledgers, tools, and anything that could still be sold. People crowded into surviving buildings, temporary shelters, nearby plantations, and relatives' homes. Enslaved residents were relocated according to owners' needs, often into more precarious arrangements. Governor Esteban Miró described misery, crying, and sobbing among the displaced. Spanish authorities organized relief, food, shelter, and eventually financial help, but aid did not erase hierarchy. A prosperous property owner could seek credit, hire builders, and rebuild a profitable shop or residence. A small artisan might lose home, workshop, tools, and income in the same afternoon. An enslaved person could lose a sleeping place and then be ordered into the labor of reconstructing someone else's property. The surviving buildings became lessons. The thick-walled Ursuline convent had endured while the wooden town around it disappeared. Masonry had not made it invulnerable, but it had denied the fire an easy meal. Spanish officials began encouraging brick, tile, plaster, and safer separation between buildings. Yet reconstruction moved through the same economic reality that had produced the wooden city. Brick cost more, tile cost more. Skilled masonry took time. Families needed shelter immediately. Not every owner could afford the safer answer. So New Orleans rebuilt unevenly. Some new buildings rose in masonry, others returned in wood or in hybrid construction. Madame John's legacy offers a revealing example. The earlier house on its Dumaine Street site burned in 1788. The structure built there afterward echoed the older French colonial form so closely that it now serves as one of the best visual reminders of the city that had vanished. Even after catastrophe, familiarity exerted a pull. The city was therefore becoming two things at once, a safer masonry town and a reconstructed version of its previous vulnerability. 6 years passed. Debts accumulated. Public buildings were still being rebuilt. Families were still adapting to altered streets, altered finances, and altered households. Then, on December 8, 1794, smoke rose near the parish church. New Orleans was about to learn whether the first fire had changed enough. The exact ignition of the 1794 fire is less certain. Later accounts place it near a hay store and sometimes blame children playing with flame. The details should be treated cautiously. What is not uncertain is what burned. The second fire destroyed 212 buildings. That number was smaller than 856, but numbers do not measure exhaustion. Many residents were still living with the financial and emotional consequences of the first disaster. Some structures lost in 1794 had survived 1788. Others had been built during the recovery. Families who believed the danger had passed watched flame return before reconstruction had fully settled into ordinary life. The pattern was revealing. Wooden buildings were again the most vulnerable. Important masonry structures and several public buildings survived. The city had now conducted the same experiment twice, and the result was impossible to ignore. The first fire had made brick advisable. The second made it political. Spanish authorities tightened building rules, especially for taller construction in the urban core. Brick, or brick, packed between posts, was required more widely. Walls had to be covered with stucco or lime plaster. Tile or slate roofs replaced wooden shingles. Masonry party walls separated adjoining structures. Government assistance and rebuilding loans could be tied to compliance. Fire response changed too. Pumps and buckets were distributed. Patrols were organized, including white and free black militia members. The colonial government was no longer treating fire as a sequence of private household accidents. It was treating the city itself as a machine that had to be redesigned. That distinction matters. A household can be careful with a candle. A city must assume that someone, somewhere, will not be. Safety could no longer depend on perfect behavior. It had to be built into walls, roofs, property lines, and streets. But codes are not neutral. A rule requiring expensive masonry protects the person who can afford to obey it. Poorer residents remained more likely to occupy wooden buildings outside the best regulated core or cheaper structures behind grander facades. Enslaved quarters were often rebuilt with owners' costs, not residents' safety, as the priority. Fire resistance entered New Orleans as both public protection and social privilege. And the physical result can still be read from almost any corner of the French Quarter. The features visitors call romantic were, in part, the answers to a disaster management problem. Every beautiful feature hid a warning stand on Royal Street, Chartres Street, or one of the blocks facing Jackson Square and begin with the wall. The post-fire building often meets the sidewalk directly. Instead of a detached wooden house surrounded by an exposed garden, the street presents a continuous surface of brick covered in stucco. Thick masonry slows flame. Plaster protects joints and limits the amount of combustible material exposed at the facade. A party wall rising between neighboring properties helps prevent one roof fire from becoming the next owner's fire. Now look up. Tile and slate do not ignite the way dry wooden shingles do. A spark landing on tile may still enter through an opening or ignite wood beneath it, but the roof no longer offers the same continuous fuel bed. The skyline changed because the city had learned to fear what traveled above eye level. Then, look through the carriageway. Many rebuilt houses lead from the street into an interior courtyard. These patios provided light, air, workspace, cooking space, circulation, water collection, and a shared domestic center. Families, servants, enslaved workers, customers, children, animals, and deliveries moved through them. But the courtyard also interrupted the building mass. Enclosed by masonry, it broke up roof lines and created a pocket where activity could be contained more safely than in a wooden yard exposed between houses. Finally, look at the balconies. Wooden galleries had fed earlier fires. Wrought iron and later cast iron offered railings and supports that did not burn in the same way. Wooden balcony decking could still ignite, and no iron facade made a house fireproof. But the street edge carried less fuel: brick, stucco, tile, party walls, courtyards, iron. These became the visual vocabulary of New Orleans, not because one architect invented a style, but because regulation, climate, Caribbean precedent, Spanish urbanism, and repeated trauma converged on the same answer. The rebuilt quarter began to resemble Havana, San Juan, and Andalusian towns more than the pastoral French settlement that had burned. Its forms also adapted to heat and flood: high ceilings, shaded galleries, internal air circulation, raised living areas, and courtyards made dense urban life more tolerable. Fire had not simply replaced one material with another, it rearranged domestic life. Gardens moved inward, the street wall became more formal, shops occupied ground floors while families lived above. Work and service disappeared behind carriageways. Public display moved to the facade, private life gathered around the courtyard. But architecture never builds itself. Every safer wall required clay, lime, timber, transport, skill, money, and human bodies. The quarter's most celebrated transformation therefore leads to the question tourist language most often avoids: who made the bricks? Chapter 6: The Hands Inside the Walls. The new masonry city required an industry of rebuilding. Clay had to be dug. Bricks had to be formed, dried, and fired. Oyster shells had to be burned into lime. Timber was still needed for floors and roofs. Tile had to be produced, and heavy materials moved from plantations and river landings into the city. Much of that work depended on enslaved labor. Enslaved men and women worked in brick-making, tile production, lime burning, carpentry, hauling, and construction across colonial Louisiana. Their skill was not incidental to the result. A wall that survived humidity, settlement, and heat demanded knowledge. A kiln required judgment. Plaster had to be mixed and applied correctly. Roofs, arches, stairs, doors, and galleries required trained hands. Free people of color also formed an important part of New Orleans' artisan class. Black and mixed-race masons, carpenters, plasterers, developers, and builders shaped townhouses, workshops, factories, and rental property. European architects and officials might sign plans or appear in civic records, but construction sites brought together enslaved workers, free black craftspeople, immigrant laborers, and white artisans in an unequal colonial economy. The public buildings around the Place d'Armes reveal the same contradiction at a larger scale. Andrés Almonester y Roxas, a wealthy notary whose fortune was connected to land and slavery, financed the rebuilding of St. Louis Church and helped fund the Cabildo and Presbytère. Architect-surveyor Gilberto Guillemard shaped the new civic ensemble with arcades, galleries, and masonry authority. The names of patrons and designers survived, the names of many workers did not. There is an even sharper irony. The people manufacturing the city's new safety did not receive that safety equally. Wealthy owners could obtain loans and build substantial masonry homes. Affluent free people of color could sometimes invest in property despite racial restrictions. Poor workers often remained in cheaper structures. Enslaved residents commonly lived in back-of-lot rooms, dependencies, or quarters rebuilt more economically than the main house. The safest wall on a property might therefore have been raised by someone who slept behind it in the most flammable room. This is why the fires cannot be described simply as creative destruction. The new architecture was safer. It was also born through coerced labor, debt, displacement, and unequal exposure to risk. The beauty is real. So is the cost. And once the new houses filled with people again, another transformation began. The architecture created by Spanish codes would soon become home to a population more French-speaking, Afro-Creole, Caribbean, and culturally mixed than before. Chapter 7. A New Life Behind the Facade. A post-fire townhouse did not merely look different, it organized people differently. At street level, a shop or warehouse could open directly onto the sidewalk. Customers, carts, goods, and conversation occupied the public edge. A carriage passage led inward beneath the living quarters. Beyond it, the courtyard gathered the domestic and working life visitors could not see from the street. Water was carried, food prepared, clothes washed, goods stored, repairs completed, and children watched within or around that interior space. Upper rooms gained air from doors and windows opening toward the courtyard. Balconies and galleries offered shaded circulation without forcing every movement through enclosed halls. The plan could feel private and communal at once. The street facade guarded the household. The patio pulled its residents together, but that intimacy crossed a hierarchy. Family members, tenants, hired workers, and enslaved people could share the same courtyard while occupying radically different positions within the household. Who entered through which door? Who slept in the upper front room? Who occupied a rear dependency? Who cooked near the courtyard heat? Who carried water upstairs? The building answered those questions quietly through circulation and access. After the Louisiana Purchase in 1803, Spanish administration disappeared, but its architectural logic remained. Then, in 1809, more than 9,000 refugees from Saint-Domingue, who had been expelled from Cuba, arrived. White refugees, free people of color, and enslaved people. They expanded the city's Francophone and Afro-Creole population and filled its rebuilt neighborhoods with new family networks and cultural life. This helps explain a strange outcome. The physical city became more Spanish in construction just as its population became intensely French-speaking and Caribbean in culture. Architecture and identity moved in different directions. That divergence is the key to the name French Quarter. The label is not completely false. France founded the city, French engineers laid out the grid, French language and Creole culture remained central. But if the name is used to describe the buildings alone, it hides the empire and disaster that produced them. The neighborhood's French identity survived the fires. Its French architecture largely did not. Chapter 8. How a Spanish city became the French Quarter. Walk into Jackson Square today, and the contradictions surround you. St. Louis Cathedral stands on the site of the church lost in 1788, reconstructed in the Spanish era, and altered again in the 19th century. The Cabildo presents its arcaded facade on one side. The presbytere mirrors it on the other. Together they form a civic ensemble created through Spanish colonial rebuilding and later modification. Across the square, the Pontalba buildings extend long rows of brick and cast-iron balconies. They came later, in the American period of the mid-19th century, yet they continued the masonry and iron language the fires had made dominant. The result feels ancient and unified, even though it was assembled across empires and decades. That visual unity is part of the illusion. In the early 20th century, tourism and preservation campaigns increasingly marketed the Vieux Carré as the French Quarter. The name offered romance, old Europe beside the Mississippi, balconies covered in plants, courtyards hidden behind walls, and a neighborhood seemingly untouched by time. But preservation did not uncover an original French city. It protected the post-fire city that had replaced it. Beginning in the 1930s, the Vieux Carré Commission received legal authority to regulate exterior changes and defend the neighborhood's overall historic character, its tout ensemble. Preservationists fought demolitions and required new construction to harmonize with the quarter. They preserved something extraordinary. They also helped freeze a selective story into the facades. Visitors learned to see the quarter as timeless French charm. The Spanish codes became background. The two fires became anecdotes. Enslaved brickmakers and free black builders nearly disappeared. The disaster-born streetscape became a style rather than evidence. This is the secret behind the quarter's authenticity. It is authentic, but not in the simple way its name suggests. It authentically records fire, Spanish rule, Caribbean influence, American additions, black craftsmanship, slavery, migration, commercial adaptation, and 20th century preservation, all occupying the same blocks. And the few buildings associated with the older French town, especially the Ursuline convent and the French form house known as Madame John's legacy, now look exceptional precisely because so much of their world burned away. Chapter 9. The City That Is Still Not Fireproof. Masonry changed New Orleans. It did not conquer fire. Behind many stucco facades are wooden floors, stairs, roof frames, partitions, and balcony decks. Kitchens produce heat. Electrical systems age. Adjacent buildings remain close. Fire entering concealed wood can move beyond the defenses visible from the street. That is why later fires have continued to damage historic buildings in the quarter. The old codes reduced risk, they did not eliminate it. Preservation adds another difficulty. Modern safety systems must enter structures whose walls, rooms, finishes, and facades are legally and culturally protected. Every alteration negotiates between preventing the next loss and preserving evidence of the previous one. The neighborhood therefore lives inside the same tension that created it, beauty and danger sharing a wall. Look again at the Ursuline convent. Its survival through both 18th century fires makes it a witness to the wooden city, the Spanish rebuilding, the American era, and the preservation age. Look at Madame John's legacy, a post-fire reconstruction that remembers an older form. Look at the cathedral, cabildo, and presbytere built after destruction to project religious and imperial stability. Each building tells a different version of survival. None tells the whole story alone. The whole story exists in the change between them, from detached timber to continuous masonry, from exterior garden to interior courtyard, from shingle to tile, from wooden gallery to iron, from household caution to public regulation, and from a French colonial town to a Spanish-built district remembered as French. Fire did not design every balcony or dictate every courtyard. Climate, culture, fashion, money, and family life shaped them too. But fire accelerated the change. It gave officials the authority to enforce it. It made residents accept costs they had resisted. And after the second catastrophe, it made the old city feel impossible. That is how fire secretly rebuilt New Orleans. Not as an architect drawing plans, but as a threat powerful enough to change what everyone believed a city should be. Ending. The alarm inside the architecture. Return to Good Friday, 1788. A candle touches lace. Flame reaches a wooden roof. Wind carries sparks above the streets. The church bells remain silent. Families learn of the danger from smoke, shouts, heat, and neighbors running toward them. 5 hours later, the city they knew has almost disappeared. If the story ended there, the fire would be remembered only as destruction. But New Orleans burned again, and repetition turned catastrophe into policy. The city rebuilt its alarm system not only with bells, pumps, buckets, and patrols, but with architecture. Brick walls became warnings made solid. Stucco became a protective skin. Tile roofs remembered the sparks. Courtyards remembered the crowded lots. Iron balconies remembered the wooden galleries that fed the flames. The most recognizable features of the French Quarter are therefore not decorations placed on history. They are historical memory built at full scale. But memory is never innocent. The rebuilt city protected those who could afford masonry first. Its civic monuments were financed by colonial wealth. Its bricks, lime, timber, and walls depended heavily on enslaved labor and on free black craftspeople whose skill rarely received equal recognition. The people who made New Orleans safer did not all receive safer lives, and the district tourists call French carries the physical face of Spanish rule, Caribbean precedent, American additions, and generations of Afro-Creole labor and culture. The fires did not improve New Orleans without cost. They destroyed homes, livelihoods, records, and security. They forced thousands into displacement. They deepened debt and demanded years of rebuilding. To celebrate only the beauty that followed would turn suffering into decoration. Yet to look at the quarter without seeing the fires is to miss why it looks this way at all. New Orleans burned because its first city was made of wood, flame was part of daily life, wind could join one roof to the next, and public protection was weak. It burned again because the first lesson had been learned unevenly. It survived by placing that lesson into law, labor, and walls. Today, the bells can ring, but the deeper alarm is still there. It is written into every brick facade, every tiled roof, every enclosed courtyard, and every iron balcony that rose from the ashes of the city before it.